This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm Jamie Bogner. This is podcast episode 238. I am sitting in the same room that I was in last week's for last week's podcast. But joining me now on this episode is Dr. Laura Burns, one of the most academically qualified people we've ever had here on the podcast, Director of Research and Development for Omega Yeast. Welcome to the podcast, Laura.
Thank you. So proud to be here. It's a fun thing to be able to talk with you and just talk science.
It's I feel like I've seen you a lot lately. Like I saw you in Asheville. You came out to help and support and help folks at our brewery workshop in Asheville, North Carolina, learn about yeast and that kind of process as they get into their brewery programs. And then we connected in Chicago a few weeks ago, and we recorded a class for our all access video program on thiols, a very hot topic these days, and biotransformation. And so if you are an all-access subscriber to Craft Beer and Brewing, then you will see that video come through sometime soon. We're not going to talk about those things because, we're just a tease like that. We're going to make you subscribe for that kind of thing. But today, Laura, we're going to talk about Haze. It's a subject you were presenting on at the Craft Brewers Conference here in Minneapolis, and we're going to talk about using London Ale3. We're going to talk about creating haze stability. We're going to talk about all those fun technical pieces of making hazy IPA better. But before we do that, what if you could chill your beer with a more efficient chiller? The answer, G&D Chiller's new micro-channel condensers. G&D's micro-channel condensers are highly efficient in hotter regions, use a fraction of the refrigerant over traditional chillers, which provides less opportunity for leaks, along with lower global warming potential. G&D Chillers engineers are committed to green technology design while developing a more energy-efficient chiller for the brewing industry. Contact G&D Chillers today at gdchillers.com. Also, get Back to the Future with Weyermann Iceria 1924. Made from the oldest German malting barley variety, Iceria shows malty sweet flavor and a soft biscuit-like aroma. This heirloom malt makes amazing traditional Bavarian-style lagers, not to mention modern craft lagers and malt-forward ales. For more info, samples, and orders, please go to go.bsgcraft.com/contact-us. Laura, let's talk about your history. What's your story? How'd you get in this brewing industry, and what drew you into it? And, how did you follow an arc through that? You've worked on the professional brewing side, and now you are working in the lab side and doing, working for Omega Yeast. What's the history look like?
Well, kind of started where a lot of people started, with just a lot of passion about fermentation. So my kind of training is very academic oriented. I did a PhD at Vanderbilt University. I studied yeast and their stress responses and all sorts of crazy.
Vanderbilt's okay. It's an SEC team. I am a Florida Gator, and we beat you most years. So
I wasn't. Yeah, I wasn't. I was at the tailgate, but probably not the game much. Yeah,
for sure. But I also went to college in Tennessee, so but not a school of that size.
Yeah, I was there for grad school. It was quite a different experience, but it was a wonderful time because it was like just when Nashville started off getting kind of all the food and the beer, and I was inspired by some of those early breweries in Nashville because I came from the Northeast. I grew up in upstate New York, so I had a lot of exposure to some real great craft beer. Right. And then came down to the Southeast, and I was hungry and thirsty for that. So some of that meant that I homebrewed, and I got some fun beers out on my own, and then I also just got to know the local scene and really start to just work my way into the industry. Yeah. So after I finished grad school, I was kind of really just tossing it around. What really do I want to do, and what am I most passionate about? And I was certainly passionate about the academic science route, but at the time it really wasn't fitting into life. I'm married, and there's some you just don't pick up and leave for 2 years, So we worked on that, and I just found that to be a really new opportunity for me, and to explore something that I was really passionate about, and that was beer. And before that, I was fermenting everything, so like beer was definitely like the side that I saw a lot of science going into. So
you decided to go work at a brewery then?
Yeah,
with a PhD.
Yeah, I know. People commented frequently about me scrubbing the floors, and I'm like,
what
that is my job.
What a great way to pay off those student loans.
Yeah, I know. Well, luckily, you as a grad student, you do research that you're paid, but the stipend's really low.
Right.
So it wasn't hard for me to start in brewing. I was already kind of
you were used to making nothing.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, and I also knew how to work hard, and I knew what I was driven by my own curiosity, and I just
So what'd you do?
So I started partnering with a close friend of mine, Gar Schwartz, and he had just opened a brewery, Tennessee Brewworks, in Nashville at the time, and really just asked, could we get your microbiology experience to get our lab going? And I feel like a lot of people started off that way. They realized all the science that goes into brewing and then got hooked. So that was my story. I found these are way cooler experiments. I get to drink it. And everybody who's drinking it also gives me some feedback. So, it's better than 6 years of a PhD and kind of, not being able to tell anyone what you do.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So it was a fun step into the brewing scene, and something that my family is a bunch of artists. So art and food has been a big part of my upbringing, and they were always kind of weirded out by my sciencey side. So now they get it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
But
where'd you go from there?
I was there 2.5 years, head brewer, quality lead, and got my feet under me in the brewing industry, understood production a little bit better, understood procurement, understood TTB reporting, whatever. I just got a feel for, what you needed to do in production as a head brewer. And then I moved to Chicago and started up at a new contract brewing facility, Great Central Brewing Company, and commissioned a beautiful 50-barrel Rolec and a CFT canning line, and had a bunch of just great learning opportunities there, especially working with our customers. I got to brew for a lot of really awesome breweries in
For sure. They are brewing you were brewing a lot of beer with some pretty phenomenal brewers there.
Yeah. And taking in a recipe and kind of really hitting and matching to what they expect out of it, and also building trust and building good relationships. It was a fun time there. So, but from there, I unanticipated, I had no real, I wasn't seeking out the bench per se, because I really do enjoy production. But Lance Shaner at Omega Yeast, the owner, and also a yeast PhD, he approached me and just said, we're really wanting to push innovation. They were actually all about innovation even before I started.
Sure.
Some of the fun, they were the first to offer commercial lacto pitches. They were the first to introduce a beer yeast hybrid into the craft scene, and they were the first U.S. North American supplier for Fike yeast.
Right.
So that was what I walked into. So I already had this foundation of innovation, and really knew that they were driven and passionate about that. So then it's the dream job,
Right.
Yeah. So then I've been there 3 years now.
Come build and expand a lab and help jumpstart. Well, I shouldn't say jumpstart. They were already doing it, but help accelerate some of the projects that they had in the works.
Yeah, and the beginning was really kind of setting the stage of what projects we were going to start really diving into.
Right.
And we talked about thios with you. That was one of the first projects I started. Was really inspired by Sauvignon Blanc wine.
Sure.
So I went really wholehearted into that project from the beginning. And then, some of the other projects like Haze kind of were observations and interesting. And, you know, when you're a scientist, you keep your eyes open.
Sure.
Yeah. So we picked up on this, and we just felt like it was really informative and helpful. Maybe some brewers had figured this out, but to put it into an experiment, give really like solid data to support, you know, those anecdotes was really, really fun.
And you all have built a nice team there too. You know,
Yes.
you've pulled other folks, you know, again, other folks that have worked in that brew house and understand what's going on, but also have that science lean to them, like Allison Lang, who was at Old Ox,
Yep.
and some others, you know, to kind of look at product development on a yeast side from the perspective of a brewer.
Yeah, and in a practical sense, like
Right.
really just trying to like provide the tool or the resource, right? We're not just trying to market yeast. We're
Sure.
actually here to like be collaborative, and I mean the industry's about that. So like my friends
right.
want to ask a question, and we just take it on, you know. So it's definitely, you know, I think just driven by pure curiosity and circumstance of like, you know, what worked, and just building off of that. So,
Well, let's talk about some of those specifics and some of those pragmatic things that brewers out there making hazy beer can really learn from. But before we do that, is your brewery struggling to source or afford berry ingredients? Historic heat waves devastated U.S. berry crops, causing supply to dwindle and prices to skyrocket. That's why brewers are switching over to Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends, which mimic straight concentrates but at a better price point and with a more reliable supply. Is it any surprise that Old Orchard's best sellers are raspberry and blackberry flavors? Reclaim your margins and order your craft concentrates at oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, Arrived, mobile point of sale powers places with personality. Arrived is streamlining business operations for the makers of craft with an all-in-one solution that was built with love by hospitality professionals. No contracts and no monthly fees make Arrived a no-brainer for your craft business. Go to arrived.com/CBB to set up a free customized demo. That's Arrived, ARRYVED.com/CBB. A different kind of POS has arrived. So, Laura, let's talk about Haze. Where do we start?
I mean, we took a very obvious yeast-centric approach to this because I think the puzzle is everything. It's all the raw materials and how they play together. But a lot of the information had really been focused on the malt side. And it's really great information, but also information that had been gleaned from chill haze and permanent haze developing when it's not desired,
Right.
was not really fitting into like kind of what the craft brewer needed to build a successful recipe for a hazy IPA. So we wanted to kind of make sure we were filling the gaps. One of the things as a brewer at Great Central, you know, we were taking a lot of customers that were taking very different approaches. And one of the big approaches I saw being like the distinction was the yeast choice, and how easy it was to develop that stable colloidal haze and what level of haze you were getting as a result. So, you know, clearly we were centrifuging all our beer, so none of this was yeast in suspension.
Right.
And it just brought that like kind of curiosity.
Wait,
like,
it's not lazy brewing?
no.
Or what are you talking about?
No, like you don't want to have to like tip your kegs or
Sure,
do
sure.
anything. You want it to be consistent and stable.
Right.
Yeah, and there's still so much of that out there. Like people really do think there needs to be yeast in suspension to get a hazy IPA, but it's just really not that. So I was curious as to like, why are we getting more haze out of these certain recipes? And is it the grist? Is it the hopping schedule? Is it the yeast? You know, this all is like a big, complex, like network of interactions.
Right.
What's really making the difference here? So like, yeah, context of brewing brought me to the bench. Some of the initial observations we saw at the bench were just like wildly dramatic in the differences between different yeast strains and what was like providing a more stable haze. Like straight up, now we call some of our yeast haze positive. Yeah.
Haze positive yeast.
Yeah. And it really is that these yeast.
For those who aren't following on that, like that's a riff on like the POF, phenolic off flavor positive, POF positive or POF negative.
Yeah. And actually it's like a riff on genetics, because we always call, like when we have a phenotype, we kind of classify that as a, that's like the trait that we're observing. So it's Haze positive.
Or STA positive.
Exactly.
If it's diastatic.
Yeah.
Sure.
So,
HAZ positive. It's got to have a scientific acronym for it, right?
Yeah, I thought I would be like really creative and make it Haze positive. But we just kind of started bucketing these strains into their categories where we were really observing like.
What makes something haze positive? What are there some traits to those that you found, and like what falls into that bucket? And then in terms of that, I mean, imagine that things are never binary or black and white. There's a spectrum to all these things, and yeast will also fall across that spectrum. How do you define those things?
Honestly, that's so interesting to just think about. I mean, there's what plays out here is like these yeast are related, but they're different, right? And there's a spectrum of like how we've domesticated them.
Right.
So some of the traits we kind of observe with some of the strains we call haze positive are they were traditionally top cropped yeast. We don't know really how that plays in, but maybe it changed the cell wall composition and made them more buoyant, and also indirectly leads to this other phenotype, haze positive. There's a lot of like very big questions still remaining on the actual mechanism to these yeast providing haze, but some of them are unrelated, but like in their, family tree per se. They're not sister strains, but they might be cousins. So we know, some of this might have evolved separately in the way that we've selected for these traits in yeast. So a Hefeweizen strain isn't quite like sister to London L3, but it also does fall into this haze positive yeast class, and it was also a top cropped yeast. So there's some definitely there's some correlations here, and I think the main takeaway is that they're doing something unique. It's not based on flocculation. It's really their ability to stabilize a colloidal dry hop dependent haze, and London L3, no.
Sure,
that's quite
not
obvious.
A big surprise.
Yeah.
Sure.
It actually is on that spectrum of the highest haze promoting strain that we have. Really is haze positive, on the high end. And then another one that's up there is our Voskavike. It's really, really good at stabilizing haze. People have a lot of success brewing hazies with that strain too. And then, a closely related British strain that we have, our British L5, we find is also haze positive. And then this German Hefeweizen strain and Kolsch strain.
Kolsch strain, it's so funny. We've talked about that before, and apparently, and the Kolsch strains, it's very popular with brewers known in Texas. As I found, I know that St. Elmo and Pint House and others are all brewing with Kolsch yeast, and it is kind of its own thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I, again, I've heard people have success brewing hazies with these Kolsch yeast. So we're seeing, brewers find this out coincidentally. We're just starting to establish more of the data to support it.
So what is this mechanism that allows for these yeasts to stabilize this colloidal haze within a beer?
We are working on the deep mechanism, right? But overall, there's...
And I am a layperson on this. I'm going to get way over my head.
Let's cover what we can cover, I guess.
Sure.
Explain
it to me as if I'm as dumb as I am, yes.
Not at all. Okay. I'm going deep. So when you're talking about haze, it's a colloidal suspension of they're really insoluble, but they become kind of that colloidal suspension, so they stay in solution.
What is they?
So they're protein polyphenol interactions most likely, but there might be other things involved. We don't know how the yeast plays in directly, but proteins from the malt, like the proline-rich barley hordein or wheat gliadins, are major contributors to haze. and the polyphenols from malt, but also from hops, which we see with dry hop dependent haze. Those hops are probably maybe not just contributing polyphenols, but probably polyphenols is a big player there.
Right.
So yeah, the idea is that these proline rich proteins interact with polyphenols, stack, and make a bunch of hydrogen bonding and interactions that create this stable haze. And it just results in, work from Hopstein or John Paul May suggests like it's an emulsifier and carrier for a hop aroma. Some of the insoluble hydrocarbons can be solubilized with haze. And then, we're just seeing more evidence for people to prefer these hazy IPAs. And some of it might be interplay between esters that the yeast makes and these hop profiles, or maybe the haze is actually that flavor enhancer that we're seeing with these beers too. So we're learning a lot still, but yeah, the haze itself is likely just this colloidal suspension of the malt proteins and hop polyphenols.
That's an interesting one. So now if we back up on that and think about how to then, if the goal is to build a hazy IPA with these, polyphenols from malt and hops in colloidal suspension, you have to start with both ingredient choices on the malt and the hop side, because certainly those can impact, what you're then what you're creating as inputs that then go into this kind of system, and of course how you run a mash into a system is going to impact whether things can work. Talk to me a little bit about that kind of, what you've learned through that approach. Are there mash strategies that will help you create the kind of malt polyphenols that will then stay in suspension rather than drop out of suspension?
Yeah, one of the things we did with a lot of our experiences, we really simplified it to just use barley base malt and have a very simplified system and see how the interactions between yeast and hops with dry hop build that stable colloidal haze. And in that system, we can get an orange juice haze, surprisingly. So with the grist itself, barley's sufficient, but you're really rounding it out by adding in the adjuncts, adding more wheat and oat proteins, but also beta glucans. There's, a Goldilocks scenario here where maybe you're building up that protein and it's just too much and you're not getting stable haze. But you'll find the grist is just that balancing, of, maybe I don't want to be more than 30% adjunct. Maybe I want to just make sure I'm giving enough to kind of add to some of, it's just not a guarantee.
It's similar. Yeah. It's similar to dry hopping. You
Yeah.
know, there's a point where you hit a tipping point, and the more you put in, the more that those larger particles just start dragging things out with them, rather than actually leaving something back there.
Yeah.
In the liquid itself.
Stability.
Right. and so that stability point. So talk to me about the is there a general adjunct oat and wheat component that you all have found doesn't, after a certain point, doesn't add to this kind of stability and only detracts from that stability? And is there something to mashing temperature, especially when it comes to barley, or other types of strategies, whether that's step mashing, that that tends to produce a kind of element that is more stable in haze?
Yeah. So with the malt, in our experiments, we basically increased percentages of malted wheat or flaked wheat in our recipes to see, where were we seeing the best results. And we were hitting that tipping point. So we definitely were seeing wow, 50% wheat is crystal clear. What's that about? So, partly it's going to be really dependent on what grain you source and if it's unmalted, malted, flaked, or how it's prepared and the specs that you get from your maltster. But it's complicated, so I can't give you really straightforward answers there. But when designing a hazy,
I'm still going to ask you. I'm going to still try to dive into all the particulars here.
Yeah, I think the mash schedule in a hazy is really kind of to target attenuation and maybe more so than it is to dial in the haze. I think, a high mash to limit fermentability and the London L3 strain is super popular for hazy IPAs. It doesn't really utilize maltotriose very well. So when you mash in the alpha range, that produces more maltotriose, and it's a little bit harder for yeast to ferment. So people mash a little higher to develop that mouthfeel and that body and that residual sweetness. But yeah, I'm not.
So you can get those high Platos that all the kids love.
Yeah, I know. So on the brew house, like when I was brewing a bunch of hazies, like you would think, oh, God forbid, don't put a protein rest in there. Like you might screw it up completely. But we had a protein rest on a hazy that was beautiful, but it helped laughterability considerably. Like we would end up 6 hours in the lauter without it, and a half bag of ricels, or this subtle change on a protein rest with like limited agitation, gentle mash transfers. Like we implemented these things to make the laughterability improve, but we still made super hazy, super thick hazy IPAs. So there's still, you get some flexibility there. You just have to like dial in the process and make sure that, it works for production and also works for the end result.
So where do you end up with some of these adjuncts like wheat and oats? And is there a format that you find leads to more stability versus less stability?
Again, I would say I've seen so much
there's
variation.
So many choices here.
Yeah.
I know there's lots of things that you can do. Right? Yeah. Everyone has the caveat there. Yeah.
I'm thinking I probably have more experiments to get at it and really define it. But it's just more to the approach and kind of the design of your recipe. Sometimes like less is more. You don't have to go too high. And, a 20 or a 10% wheat might get you beautiful haze. We did all of our experience 100% barley and we had haze. So there's ways to coax it out of like that yeast component, like getting a haze positive yeast in there. So, and people don't want haze all the time. What we hope was like, we're not just studying how to make a hazy IPA. We give a little bit more information into how to make any beer.
Sure. But London L3 can also make clear beer, and it's also very possible for that to happen.
Absolutely. And we have an experiment for that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So part of our story actually, so we were doing a bunch of trials for mitigating hop creep, and we had like 2 different strains we were running, Chico and London L3. So that experiment straight up defined haze positive, haze neutral for us, because we saw on later dry hopping, this milky colloidal haze was developing with London L3 and just barley and 2 pounds per barrel of a USDA grown triple pearl. But it was like pale ale clear on Chico. And so when we established that system, it gave us a lot to like basically build off of, and we could test a lot more variables. But one of the variables was dry hop timing. And when you moved the dry hop up into the early phase of fermentation where you're like high krausen, like maybe under 50% attenuated, those dry hoppings were resulting in kind of like that clear London L3 beer. Like, whoa, what happened? So like a control non-hopped beer and a knockout or early dry hop beer were clear, like about, when I hate saying clear because it's not clear beer. It's not clear Pepsi,
right.
but non-hazy.
Sure.
And then so like your measurements on
they might have an unfiltered look, but they wouldn't be considered
pale ale,
modern hazy. Yeah.
Like it's just maybe a little bit of chill haze. That's that.
Right.
And then you move into the late dry hopping and you get massive orange juice milky haze where it's like, so from the measurements on haze we use in the brewery, NTUs or nephelometric turbidity units, we were going from, pale ale territory of like, 20 to 100 up to literal orange juice turbidity, like 600, 700, with just the difference in dry hop timing.
Which is such an interesting one because, again, there is also a conventional logic about dry hopping early to achieve that kind of biotransformation piece, but it's interesting that you're now saying that can also actually lead to less hazy beer if you dry hop at that kind of timing.
Yeah, and like I said, there have been enormous amounts of anecdotes we've heard where like nothing changed. And it's important because like we don't consider that a change. Like you change your dry hop timing, that doesn't necessarily feel different. But it was making a big impact on like whether people were beginning to experience that, oh shit, my haze is not hazy, you know, like and you know, troubleshoot that and actually have some good data to support, like, you know, we find early editions don't do really well for haze. And you know, even the myth on biotransformation, maybe it's not a myth, but like, in my head, I don't necessarily think it has to be an early dry hop. I mean, a whirlpool works for saturating with like these precursor compounds or monoterpene alcohols, like to help promote biotransformation through fermentation. But the dry hop, like, it's okay if you have a later dry hop. We're still seeing, it's like diacetyl clearance. You end up seeing some activity post-fermentation. Like, shouldn't be reliant on that early dry hopping for that biotransformation. You can get it other ways.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I want to drill down on that a little bit more. But before we do that, from the rotatable pickup tube on Rogue Brewing's pilot brew house to the integrated hopbacks on Sierra Nevada's twin prototyping brew houses, SS Brewtech has taken technology they invented working with world-renowned industry veterans and made them available to every craft brewer. To learn more about SS Brewtech's innovation list, head on over to ssbrewtech.com. Laura, that just seems to fly in the face of so much of this logic here. What do you think is the mechanism that then is somehow causing earlier dry hopping to then, you know, pull out the haze from the beer?
Oh man, we've tried taking a couple of different approaches. We thought maybe, okay, pH at the beginning of fermentation is different from the pH at the end of fermentation. We know pH is important for these colloidal complexes to form. Maybe it's pH. And then we just adjusted a bunch of knockout pHs between 4 and 6. None of that seemed to play in for this development of haze in the late dry hopping. So knockout pH wasn't really playing in for us on our experiments. You know, it's probably one of those things that makes a difference. It just wasn't the be-all, end-all for us.
Sure.
And, you know, so we were getting at different things like, oh, wow, is this like, we started doing yeast blends to kind of get at this too, because if you have a haze positive strain, is this something the haze positive strain is doing or not doing? So is it an added phenotype or is it a lack of a phenotype? Maybe haze neutral strains are just removing haze. Right. So we started doing blends and we started seeing the haze positive was kind of taken over. We were getting hazy beers with the blends. So now we're kind of thinking, wow, there's something, you know, that the haze positive yeast are actively doing to promote haze. And we're just trying to figure that more out with some different approaches. You know, we're partnering for more genomic-based approaches, and we're also looking into the proteomics, getting really deep, looking for that mechanism. You know, we think it's probably related to the cell wall because, you know, we just see these phenotypes of top cropping and some different budding patterns in these haze positive strains that even their colony morphology, like you're looking at plates a lot when you're in the lab. So like these are the things we notice. And so those correlations we're trying to kind of tease out a little bit more of the mechanism behind it. But we definitely think, you know, we've got potentially some cell wall related. So yeast, they have a cell wall that's composed of proteins and carbohydrates. Their manoproteins are really rich in mannose. And also chitin is and beta glucans are on the cell wall. So there's like a lot of carbohydrate on the cell wall, but also protein. And these can play into haze. We just don't really understand that yet. I think we're just trying to evaluate, you know, how yeast is influencing this colloidal complex. So
sure.
Yeah.
Are there different, we think about, we're talking about haze almost as if it's a monolithic thing. And I imagine that it can actually be much more complex than that. And that there are also like similar levels of haze that are still produced maybe through different mechanisms, and there might be different things causing that and different qualities of that haze. Talk to me a little bit about that kind of range.
Yeah, that is super interesting, and actually some of our work in hops has kind of thought about that a little bit more too. Is like we've just looked at a bunch of different hop varieties and said like, okay, we know brewers have a lot of success with Galaxy. Does it promote more haze in our assays. And then the bench, we saw that Galaxy was one of the standouts. It really helped to promote haze. So breaking down what about the hop itself, is it only polyphenol, or are there other hop compounds playing into haze as well? So we've seen some situations where you're saying it's not monolithic, and we're getting the flip-flop of like, oh, this hop actually doesn't behave like most hops with the knockout addition. We're actually starting to see a little haze develop from this hop. Also, maybe we got a little haze with our haze neutral strain using this hop. So like some outliers there, which that's what you look for in biology. You don't want to like look for the trend. You want to see what's not fitting the trend, right? And it's like, so we're seeing that variability. We're seeing like there's a lot of interesting contributors that we'll start to maybe tease out a little bit more, but it's more, on the surface right now. We're just getting into more of the science behind it.
It sounds to me as if you're also saying that there is some hop variety or even hop terroir, and these are different things, because all of these things can impact. We're talking about, again, multivariate approach to all of these things. Whether it's hop variety or origin of hop, that could potentially impact haze and haze stability.
Absolutely. Yeah. It might be down to processing. It also might be down to variety or terroir. We have looked at
processing, so like temperature.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of variables there. So even harvest timing, who knows,
Sure.
But we have seen when we look at different suppliers with the same variety, we do see trending on certain varieties, like ones that tend to be more haze promoting, like a Galaxy, are consistently haze promoting. One that maybe don't produce as much haze. We actually see Mosaic doesn't put out a lot of haze.
It's such a popular hop in hazy beers, and it doesn't make a lot of the haze.
And I guess like it may, and maybe we'll find, there's who knows? Mosaic has so many other attributes. You're not going to not use it. It's just, figuring out like a little bit more about, what about the hop exactly is contributing to haze. Yeah.
And then Citra?
It's pretty it's kind of like just middle of the road, It produces good haze, but it's not like Galaxy haze.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What, if we're talking about hops, what does that range look like? Galaxy is a extra hazy producer. Where do you kind of start, moving down the spectrum from there?
Yeah. So the range I would say would be like 200 to 600 NTUs. So it's that's a pretty good range. That's like hazy pale ale to like milky New England, right? So, but the Galaxy is on that end of the spectrum. Like we see Sabro up there. Pato is another one that kind of stood out. We have a hop that we used for majority of the assays is just a USDA grown triple pearl variety. Triple pearl. But it worked really well in these experiments and had that kind of haze activity of a Galaxy. But there's a variety like that other end of the spectrum, like maybe the Mosaics or Brew One was a hop from Haze that we gave a try on because we heard people used it to help promote haze. And it turns out it actually helps promote haze with haze neutral yeast, but it wasn't really good with a haze positive yeast.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So there's like that, the science is pretty interesting. So
that gets wildly weird, Are there hops that you find detract from that haze production?
No. And even cryo.
You're just being nice when you say that. I can tell.
No, I don't. I really don't think. I think we are getting haze mostly across the board.
Yeah.
It's just the level of haze. We haven't seen any other than the timing of dry hop being like that knockout dry hop being almost like a clarifying effect. The hops tend to perform within a similar range on haze potential. It's just some of them are on the far the kind of like lower end of the range. Yeah. And so side note, the clarifying effect, I say that because when you do a knockout addition, or like we call it knockout, but that means basically hops at fermenter full, like before pitch or on pitch, really at the beginning of fermentation. When you do that addition and you do a late dry hop addition, you'd expect to get haze from the late dry hop addition, but you kind of already removed that potential with the earlier addition. So you're seeing less haze with just a small addition at knockout than you would see with just only doing the addition late fermentation. Yeah. So it is like a clarifying agent almost.
You're pulling something out that won't ever come back once you do that.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So then strategically, what do you find? You want to finish that fermentation then before you dry hop?
Yeah. And the best case for the brewer, right, is that you could harvest your yeast and pitch it off into the next tank before dry hop.
Right.
And this is when we see haze. Like, it works out really well. So, if
I know you're telling me the truth when you say that, because you work for a company that sells yeast and does not have a financial stake or an upside to brewers then cropping their own yeast and reusing and repitching them.
Well, yeah, but
you would much rather sell them a new pitch for every batch. But what you're saying is that
we're not afraid to talk about that. I think it's a good thing for us to have like good success and results.
I appreciate that truthfulness.
Yeah, I know. And talking to the people at your brewery accelerator thing, like people really starting out, not getting their hands into yeast management yet, and telling them like, you can repitch a hazy. It's a thing. Like, try. But yeah, I mean, there's multiple ways to do it. Some people are top cropping, which is a cool way to do it too, because these yeast are meant for top cropping. That's how they were originally domesticated. So that works, but also just timing it.
It's a reason to, put open fermenters into your brewery, right?
I mean, people love it for other, like driving esters and just getting better profiles out of the yeast itself.
It looks so good too.
Yeah, it does look really pretty. Yeah. For me as a quality manager, that just looks like a disaster sometimes, but it definitely works.
That's true. It's not a visual, like you look at it like, oh, that seems gross, but yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, you get scared a lot of times when you're on the quality side, but then you realize like, wow, I don't have to always think that this is going to be a risk. I gotta test it out first and get a better handle on how to do it.
So as we're talking about London 3, are there other fermentation level inputs or factors that that you all have found, that whether that's time, temperature, whether that's total load of things pushed into a fermenter, whether that's the way that those things are added, whether that's whole cone versus pellets, whether that's recirculation, pushing hops into a tank versus circulating that fermenting beer through an external tank with those hops. Are there some of those methods of adding these dry hops after that fermentation is complete or most complete that you found add to that kind of haze stability?
I mean, it seems to not be such a dry hopping practice is kind of the timing is the biggest influence.
Yeah.
We on our flask trials, we just drop hops into the flask. It's just like a top port on your tank. You're just adding them. There's no circ on it at all. I personally like to mitigate hop creep and kind of thinking about how your hopping practices play into haze and hop creep, I think is really important. So there's two strategies. You can either add hops while you're still kind of like at that tail end of fermentation. You add a lot of yeast activity and the hop creep isn't so dramatic. You're not seeing that hang. So like get it while it's active kind of thing. And the diacetyl clearance is already pretty good. Or, drop temp and minimize the contact time. So keep it cold and keep it on the hops for less time, and you will mitigate that hop creep as well. But both of those practices are going to be helpful in promoting haze too. So for me, it'd be more important to emphasize how does this work into the other aspects of this beer and production that you're brewing, and making sure that you don't just kind of extend yourself on one principle and really not let it fit into production.
What do you mean by that?
I think some of these, okay, I'm going to early dry hop because I want biotransformation, but now I can't repitch my yeast. That's not helpful. You need to make sure that you have good yeast management and find a solution for that. Maybe it's top cropping. But try not to like, implement something that's just really not practical.
How do you top crop off of a cylinder conical fermenter that that is so common these days? I mean, they're not really built for that kind of thing.
Yeah, one of the big lessons for me in using London L3 is actually like, it's such a robust krausen, like it just produces this really thick krausen that if you're filling fermenter full and you're not allowing for headspace, or maybe you're fermenting a little warmer, or you're under pitching, you tend to like lose all the yeast at the first day because it's blowing off the tank and it's all in the drain. So learning how to like, I wasn't collecting yeast off of that krausen, but that is a way that you would just be pulling that yeast from krausen. Yeah. So people have implemented that and they've done it pretty well with like hygienic ways. So, just making sure you have a CIP arm or you can harvest off of, and you have hygienic ways of getting it into your harvest vessel. People put a little CO2 on the bottom of the tank to help rouse it out. So if it's not actively blowing off, just a little CO2 pulse will definitely push it out. Method. Actually, Jessica Young had a TQ article with the MBAA that kind of laid it out on how they implemented it at Bearded Iris. And that was one of the like kind of really good resources for breweries who are trying to top crop. Yeah. But yeah, it's possible. I always thought of that's above and beyond because I'd rather just time my dry hop a little bit later.
Yeah.
But depending on how you want to approach it, maybe that's important to you. So, and then with London L3, I think I like to give tips and tricks because I think it's a little bit of a weird oddball, obviously. So it's not very good at utilizing maltotriose, so you're expecting less attenuation on it. So like your mash is really important. So if you want to drive attenuation, you got to hit beta amylase, like 148 mash temps. If you're trying to optimize like kind of that residual unfermentable like kind of mouthfeel to the beer, you're going to target higher. Maybe even 156 or, just really high on the alpha range. And the oxygenation rates are really important for that strain. It seems to be really needy for oxygen. I was working on a system that was German and I only had compressed air. And I had a lot of trouble getting reliable fermentations with London L3 until we moved to, I said we have to go to oxygen. So we went to oxygen as our air source for aerating the wort, and that made a big difference for us. So it's really needy on oxygen. And then if you're getting a lot of blow off on the tank, you can temp down a little bit on the initial fermentation, like just in that first 24 hours to prevent the blow off. So maybe a degree or two lower. If you were starting at 68 to free rise to 70, maybe a 66 to 68, so that you're not getting that vigorous growth krausen and it's not just blowing out of the tank. So yeah. So I think those are just helpful tips when you're working with that strain specifically.
Yeah. In addition, so we talked a little bit at the beginning about other strains than London L3 that are also Haze positive.
Right.
In terms of how those behave relative to London Ale3.
Voss is completely different, right?
Okay.
It attenuates well. It also, instead of having like the isoamyl acetate driven like ester profile, it's much more like a citrus driven fermentation profile. It's super Haze positive. It's up there with London Ale3, but it's just a very distinct strain. So you can target a different like kind of hazy style with those two yeasts because their other fermentation characteristics can differentiate. So that's kind of
how would you describe then that Voss kind of haze profile relative to something like London L3?
Just like a little drier, like maybe a little bit more like Chico or Conan like, where you're just getting a little bit like more attenuation, just a little bit crisper. It's still obviously like that mouthfeel comes through with the haze. It's just not a sweetness. So that's kind of a fun angle to it. People, depending on what they're targeting on the finishing gravity, they're looking for maybe a little bit drier profile. I think Voss works really well for that. Voss can be used at low temps and high temps. So when we talk about dry hop timing, if you're at a high temp, 90 degrees, like your dry hop timing in early fermentation is really only that first 24 hours because you're already like attenuated by day 2. So it's like a weird, like, we talk about dry hop timing. It's really relative to the degree of attenuation. So, but, it's also, pretty, there can be some more cave character out of a higher fermentation temperature, or more just, I think, balanced kind of hop complementing profile of Voss is a kind of a standard ale temp, where you're getting much more of that citrus, bump to it, and it's just like clean ferment.
When you say quite character, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think for me in perception, it seems to be like maybe there's a little bit of like this twang or like organic acid kind of addition at higher temps, or just like putting a little bit more perceived like acidity or kind of like this just twang, I guess. It's not even It's not even like tart. It's just a little bit of like a different mouthfeel to it. And then Voss isn't typically prone to some of the like more mushroomy kind of flavors of like Hornindal, but that can be emphasized at higher temps too.
I think especially when we start talking about hazy IPA using Quake strains, one of the things that sticks in mind over the years of those that I've tasted is that time after packaging, they seem to develop maybe in a different kind of way. They when it comes to London Ale 3, I think we're all generally familiar because it maintains a specific kind of residual final gravity that sticks, and it keeps the sweetness. Hops will obviously eventually over time start to die off, and then allow that sweetness to come through, and they also get a little more muted, a little more tame. But there's in some of the, especially the earlier Quake based hazy IPAs that I've had, I thought that fresher they were brighter, and that over time they almost developed, you say mushroominess, that actually sounds like a decent way to describe something like that, but maybe a little earthiness or a little more kind of dirt earth kind of character to them over time. I mean nothing's going to last forever. We're talking about compounds that are going to change over time regardless. But I'm curious about that, if there's something scientific to that, or if that is just perception based on some beers that I've tried.
Right now, I would say we share a perception similar to that. Like I would, you do.
And those beers after like 2 or 3 weeks are one thing, and those beers after 8 weeks or 12 weeks might be a completely different thing.
Yeah, and I do think that's fermentation temp related too.
Yeah,
I think the higher temps tend to exaggerate that. So I think there's been beautiful Voss hazies that kind of last like a London Ale 3. It just, I tend to prefer like that, like normal range kind of fermentation, just to kind of keep it on that citrus profile.
Sure.
Yeah. But
So don't get greedy, brewers. Don't try to get that fermentation done in 18 hours by cranking the heat up.
Just depending on what you're going for, there's great there's like good styles for that too. Like our Lutra strain runs really hot and pretty neutral, and depending on the style, maybe you want to turn it out quick. So I mean, it's just fun to play with those strains. They're very dynamic, and yes, you can get away with high temps, but just depends on really, you're the artist here, like figure out what works.
For brewers out there, tackling this hazy IPA problem, and of course navigating and trying to figure that out, are there some key takeaways that you might sum up for them as they are tackling these brewing problems?
Yeah, I would definitely say look for a strain that makes it a little bit easier. Some of these haze positive strains that we mentioned, the London Ale 3, Voss Kvike, Kolsch strain, Hefeweizen strain. Another one of our British strains is pretty good at it too. It's not limited. There's a multiple out there, but look for those strains that, we share this work a lot. Like we presented at CBC just now, but the podcasts, other things are out there for like you to reference again. This hopefully
no one needs any other podcast.
Hopefully you come back to this podcast. But the information's available. You can use this to help build out like that haze profile on your beer and not be limited. You don't have to stick to London Ale 3. Like Yes, it's a great strain, and it's amazing for like its ester profile, and it's the way it builds like hop aroma. It's a beautiful strain, but if you're looking for something different, there's other yeast. But I would just mainly say like take a really careful look at the yeast. If it's Chico, it's great for a West Coast IPA, and it also doesn't make a very good hazy beer. So pick your yeast for your beer. And then the other thing about dry hop timing we covered is it was a surprise to us to see such a dramatic effect of dry hop timing, but those early additions don't play well in developing haze. So just limit to maybe post 50% attenuation to kind of introduce those dry
kick it out in
hops.
the whirlpool rather than putting it in there,
Yeah.
and then put the rest into your post fermentation dry hop.
Yeah, or even a day 4, day 5, day 6, whatever. It just doesn't. You don't want to have it on that first kreuzen, like the first 48 hours.
Does splitting it into multiple editions, have some sort of any kind of effect? Like, if you're going to put 6 pounds per barrel, do you put all 6 in, or do you, split it into 3 editions of 2 pounds per barrel in order to, is there some benefit to easing it on in over multiple editions over a shorter time versus all at once?
We did the double dry hopping. If you double dry hop with that early edition, it's not a great thing. But, when you're staging them later, they tend to be cumulative. So it's not like maybe it's better for developing the hop aroma, but it also, it's fine if you're staging hop additions later in fermentation for haze too.
Yeah. It's not pulling out more stuff as you add more in later on, or if you just, jam it all in up all at once.
Yeah, not in our experiments. We didn't see that. So, those later addition timings, you can split them up if you want. It still seems to help promote haze in an additive way. So
Sure.
Yeah.
Did we talk about the temperature for dry hopping and how that impacted those things?
Well, I don't have answers because all of our flask trials are at ambient kind of room temp.
Okay.
But, based on industry like trends right now, a lot of people are doing those colder dry hops and getting really nice haze. So I expect it not to matter so much. And I did have experience
so that
with those.
colder temperature's not forcing stuff to drop out as much, even with this haze.
No.
Yeah.
Yep.
You can just do it whatever.
And
range
lucky,
you want to.
And this haze you can centrifuge. You can like kind of, centrifuging. There's an advantage to that with some of these beers too, because you kind of the yeast bring bitterness. They catch that myrcene, that hop burn tends to carry over.
Right.
So like that just removing the yeast in that like the larger particles, but keeping that colloidal haze in there. It's actually pretty easy to do. So yeah.
You're designing your favorite IPA right now. What is that? What is that beer?
Oof. Don't talk. Okay. So this comes back to Thiles.
I want Dr. Laura's favorite IPA. How would you design it?
I have absolutely loved some of the beers people have been making with these new thiolized yeast, and Star Parties are.
It's a great tease because you should watch our class that's upcoming on our All Access platform on using thiols and achieving biotransformation. Just a plug.
Yeah, definitely. And so we have a Chico thiolized strain, and I think just having that, I like the attenuation. I like a dryness to an IPA. But just bumping up tropical on it, and people using mash hopping, keeping dry hopping kind of a little reserved, it helps to really drive that tropical kind of character into it. So
we talked about mash hopping with Ben Smith from Surly on the last week's episode, and around their beer Thiol and Error that you all were also involved in.
Yeah, that was fun. Yeah, so those are honestly, these are some of my favorite beers right now.
Hey.
That's what I want to drink. So
me too.
Yeah.
I love thiols. I love that flavor profile. Yeah. Any specific hops, or you just want your thiols coming from the malt itself?
I love I want the hops to come in too. Nectaron's been fun. I've had a lot of fun experiences with that. I really like the Sabro. I like Sultana. I like, there's so many kind of fun varieties coming out right now that I think for my kind of thiol beer, I want something to kind of really meld well with that tropical note. So I'm going more tropical with my hops. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, let's bring this to a close. G&D's micro-channel condensers use a fraction of the refrigerant over traditional chillers. Get back to the future with Vireman Iceria 1924. Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends offer reliable and consistent fruit flavors. Arrived was built with love by hospitality professionals and put SS Brewtech's advances to work in your brew house. What's the next thing on your horizon, Laura?
Well,
What's the next thing that you hope to tackle that is just sparking your brewing curiosity?
I think we got a lot of practical stuff out of Haze. I'm really excited to get more into the detail. So I'm definitely interested in that. Alice and I have been working on some new hybrid strains. So I like CRISPR, but I like some traditional methods too. And so hybrids have been kind of fun for us in the past. We kind of want to make sure we keep them in there. So we're working on some of those. And yeah, I mean, a lot of this is just inspiration and seeing what brewers are going for. I think we caught on to thiols real early, and it was like good timing for everything just to be able to push this. So we're hoping to catch that next one.
So hot right now.
Yeah.
If you enjoy this podcast each week, we'd love your support. Go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button. Of course, if you're planning a brewery, head on over to breweryworkshop.com for information on our next workshop in Portland, Oregon. You gonna be there, Laura?
I hope so.
Yeah, hope so.
Either Allison or I will be there. Yeah.
Fantastic. Appreciate the support of Omega on that. If people want to learn more about you, about Omega, about what you guys are doing in that brewing space, where do they find you all?
Well, we're definitely always trying to make a good stream of content for you guys through these podcasts, but also,
Sure.
We'll put up some stuff on our website and mailers and stuff to our customers, and we just expect to hear from you. So just reach out through email.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Dr. Laura Burns. Like I said, maybe the most qualified person that I've ever talked to about this kind of thing here on the podcast. Thanks for joining me. It's been really fun to talk about these things with you.
I love being a part of this. It's so much fun. Thanks for having me.
Cool. Cheers.
Yep.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.